Welcome to the DX Central 2024 State of the North American Sporadic Es season, powered by fmlist.org. I'm Lloyd Van Horn with DX Central, and today we're going to be taking a look at the midway point here, basically, of the Sporadic Es season and seeing how it's going so far. There's a lot of talk online and social media about how terrible this season has been. And it has been, it's felt like it's pretty weak as far as E seasons go. But is there data to support that? Do we see anything in the data that tells us exactly how the season has been going? And then also, is there anything in the data that might give us hope for a strong finish to the season? Well, we're going to take a look, and this is using a comparison of data that is gathered from the last 6-7 years at fmlist.org, and we're comparing it to reported data from this year as well. So let's go ahead and dive in. Now, a couple of special thanks we want to make sure we mention here before we get started too far. Special thank you to Gunter Lawrence and Mike Jeziorski. Gunter from FM List, Mike Jeziorski down in Mexico. Both were instrumental in helping us to get a hold of this data and be able to do what we need to do to compile and then do the analysis of the data. So thank you to both of them for their partnership in helping to obtain this data. A real quick dive into our methodology and a couple of disclaimers here I want to kind of mention before we get too far into the data itself. So the data that we're looking at here is specifically just for North American sporadic E receptions reported by DXers to FM List from 2017 to 2023 and then this 2024 season. No other form of reported propagation is included in this analysis, so no tropo, no meteor scatter, and things like that. Only the months of May and through August are analyzed here. So if they're, those out of the peak season, E-skip openings in like December, things like that, those are not included. And a couple of the data points we're looking at include the number of reported logs by month and year, the number of days reported of E's reception by month and year, the percent of each month where there were E-skip reported receptions coming in, the number of logs per day by month and year, and the number of logs per DXer by month and by year. So we're going to just dive into this data here and kind of see what has been happening the last couple of years and what's happening this year as a comparison. The data accuracy of what we're looking at here is entirely dependent on the accuracy of the data that's being submitted by the DXers, right? So if a DXer was trying to log a tropo catch and they identified it as an E-skip catch in their report that they submitted to FM List, obviously that's something that we have to kind of keep in mind could happen, and there's not really a way to kind of correct for that. So just keep in mind that there could be a small degree of error in some of the data here that we're looking at. So I think generally speaking, it is still directionally accurate, though. I think it's something that, the trending that we're seeing and like, is this season a high performer or a low performer season? I don't think that small degree of error is going to change that. I think what we're seeing here in the data itself is still very accurate. While we try to find an analog season here for 2024 and kind of looking back at the data to say, is there another season here that kind of compares favorably or lines up pretty well, keep in mind that there's no crystal ball to this, right? Just because we find a season that does have a clear or close analog to 2024 doesn't mean that 2024 is going to end up like that season did, right? There is no crystal ball here. There's no forecast for E's that is like widely regarded as being super accurate. So what we have to look at here is just take a look at the data that's there and see what are some outcomes that have happened in the past, and then kind of wait to see what happens this season and see if that kind of bears out here. And then kind of look back again at the end of the season and say, okay, how did it turn out? This is actually part of a larger analysis that we're doing on sporadic E. We're doing a partnership with fmlist.org here at DX Central, and so this is part of that larger project, and we'll be doing more and more analysis on E seasons, both here in North America and outside of the North American continent. And so as we have that information available and we release that, we'll make sure to announce that so that everyone can take a look at that analysis and see what's there. One other thing to keep in mind, the data we're looking at here from this year, from 2024, and probably even from some earlier years, is probably not entirely complete. There's probably going to be some more logs that are being submitted as DXers go through their IQ recordings. I know I've got some from this year and last year, and even as far back as like 2021, right? When I was in Charleston, I still have some IQ recordings that I'm going through from that season. So there may be some logs that will be added to it. I don't think it's going to be a massive shift, right? We're not talking about thousands and thousands of logs or anything like that. So again, I think the directional accuracy of the data we're looking at here is still intact. So nothing that I would think would be like a massive shift. All right. So let's start off with our analysis of the seasons from 2017 to 2023. And the reason I want to kind of start here before we do anything else is I want to set a baseline for how we're doing our analysis, right? And we need to look at that historical data to help us set a context for what we're going to be looking at with this year's data, which metrics we're looking at and how we kind of look at those, what we're looking for in those metrics. And then when we do our comparisons and we kind of average everything out from those previous years and things like that, we'll have a better sense of exactly what we're looking at. So let's start there with one of the probably the more common metrics that people will look at to compare seasons. That's total number of logs. Now, this is totally fine in generally speaking terms if you're doing this comparison for your own data, right? So if I'm looking at my data from this year and comparing it to my data from last year, I can say, well, I had more logs last year than this year, so last year was better. That's okay. That's a favorable or a fair way to look at things. But when we're looking at things on a much larger scale, like we are here, across hundreds of DXers, across a wide span of time, we can't really just line them up and compare and say, okay, which one had more logs? And so these top numbers that you see, like the 17,479 for 2021, the 17,685 for 2022, we can't really just compare that top number up there. But what we can do is we can look at kind of the breakdown of how these years looked on a kind of month-by-month basis within those years and kind of compare that structure with each other, right? So I can see that if I look at the last 3 years, for instance, 21 to 23, I can see July of 21 was a super strong month. There were a lot of logs there. So as I go through other data points, I'm going to want to look and see what else was going on in that month that might kind of tell me a story. Because that's what we're really trying to do here, is we're trying to see what story does the data tell me that was going on in that season. And we can't just get that from one metric. We can't just look at one metric and say, that's the one we're going to look at and that's going to tell the story. It's a combination of all of the different metrics, right? So that's what this is going to be about. So looking at this one here, I can tell you, like July 2021, that was the peak month of all of the months for this entire analysis. Look at that. Over 10,000 logs were submitted to FM List during that season. Now, part of the thing that you may look at this and see is, okay, there was a pretty significant jump after 2020. Was there just more DXers that were out there submitting logs to FM List? Yeah, there were. Absolutely. We're going to look at that here in a little bit. So that is a driver. And that's one of the reasons you can't just stack these seasons up against each other and make that comparison directly that way. So, yeah, there were more DXers. And another thing that you may think of is, 2018, 2017, there weren't a lot of people yet, and it's definitely not to the degree they are now, using SDRs for their FMDX and recording at least a portion of the band and then reviewing that back. And you're absolutely right. As we get into 21, 22, 23, more and more people are doing that. More and more people are also using autologgers, starting with this like 2021, 22, 23 season. So that's going to increase the volume of logs as well. These autologgers and things like that we see here in North America. So yeah, that's totally valid. And another thing that is also happening is that those seasons are better seasons than what we saw in 2019 and 2018 and 2017. So we're going to look at some other metrics that are going to kind of help tell the story very clearly, but I at least want to kind of start with this notion of let's take the volume of logs coming in. That's going to be a part of the way that we do our analysis. This metric here, we're going to be using these numbers in relation to other metrics that we look at, and that's going to help us really tell the story and see what's really happening with these seasons. Another metric that is pretty helpful to help us do this is the number of days where E's are being reported. So when we typically have done these analysis in the past and we've looked at historical data, it's usually because there's one or two DXers that are gathering data from their own logbook and their own personal experiences. And so they can say, okay, this was a good year for me, but that's really hyper-localized, right? That's down to their location. And if they're in an E-prone area, they might have an inflated view. If they're not in an E-prone area, like if they're in an area that doesn't get a lot of E's, they might have an underperforming view. So what we're trying to do here with this analysis is look at this much more holistically across DXers, the entire North American continent. So when we say days with ease reported, as long as somebody put in an e-log on a date, that's going to count, right? So you'll see, for instance, when we look at, like, let's say 2022, there were 30 days in June. All 30 days, there was somebody somewhere in North America reporting ease in the month of June of 2022. There was somebody somewhere in North America reporting ease every single day in July in 2022. That was a pretty good year, it looks like. So this is another one of those metrics that we can look at to see how active was the season. When you have seasons where there is less activity, less e-production happening, less days, fewer openings, they're not as active, but can they also still be producing better seasons? That's one of the things that we're going to look at, because one of the narratives of this year is that there's some openings, but they're not good ones. They kind of get in there and they're gone pretty quick, and there's not really a chance to really kind of dive in and get a lot of stuff before they're gone. Is that a valid narrative? Well, this is one of the things that we would look at. We would look at this number of days where E's are reported to see just how does it stack up. So looking back at that 2021 July time frame, 28 days. There were 28 days where E's were reported, and you saw how many logs were there. Compared now, July of 2022, there were 31 days. July of 2023, there were 29. And in July of 2021, outperformed both of those. All right? So what was happening in that July of 2021 that was giving us more logs compared to these other seasons where there were more days but fewer logs? That's one of the things we're going to flesh out. Since we know how many days are there in the calendar month, and we now know how many days are reported, we can come up with this kind of percentage of the month that produced E's. So again, looking at 2021, 96.7% of June, 90.3% of July. So only 90% of the month of July actually turned in E's, but it had by far and away the most productive month of the entire analysis that we've done. This is going to come in handy when we start thinking about this year, especially as we're trying to do comparisons and finding that analog season. One of the things we'll want to come back to is this average of each month. What was the average? So are we above or below average? Are we above like a normal season? Are we below a normal season? Those averages kind of like set that bar of what a normal season should look like in North America. A normal season would have about 87% of the month of June at least with E's being reported. And you can see here in the last several years, that's been much, much higher. Some years it was much, much lower, and so forth. So I think that 87% average might be a little low, personally. I think that would probably come up a little bit more if we had more data from these first 3 years. But I think we at least have a nice starting point. So the last 2020 through the current year is, I think, a little more closely aligned with what we typically would see would be somewhere in that 90 to 100% range. For June and July. So now we take, and I mentioned earlier, we're going to take some of this data, we're going to combine it with other metrics to come up with an idea of what the story is that the season is trying to tell us, and this is one of those metrics that we come up with. So we just looked at the number of days, we've already looked at the number of logs, let's combine those and come up with the number of logs per day, and this should give us a nice indicator of the performance of the season. I think just comparing logs, not on its own, is going to be very valuable. Number of days by itself is starting to get closer to an idea, but it's not telling the entire story. This one is much, much closer, because now I can look at you and I can say, in July of 2021, 359 logs per day were being reported from an e-skip opening. Was that a good year or not? Yeah, right? That's a very good year. So when we're doing our comparison, looking at 2024, we kind of know here where the bar is set. We kind of know what the averages are when we kind of average all this information out for an average July, an average June, and so forth, how much it should produce as far as those E logs in every day. This gives you an idea of the quality of the openings. Going back to that narrative for 2024, we have some openings that are happening, but they're short-lived. They're not high MUF. They're not super strong. They're usually in there and out pretty quick, and a lot of times they're isolated to very specific geographic regions rather than kind of these widespread monster openings that we see a lot of people get once or twice or 3 times a year that lead to these massive log totals. We haven't really had that this year. So this number here, this logs reported per day, can kind of tell us that, can kind of help us narrow down where we are in that as we look at 2024. Now, this next one here, DXers reporting logs, I actually don't have this data for 2024. So we're looking at this for the previous 6 years as kind of a way to kind of like, I guess, authenticate or validate some of the other numbers that we're looking at here and kind of the story that those seasons are telling us. We should have this for the end of the season. But right now, the data that I have is not deduped, right? So if I will go into FM list right now and I say, okay, on May 1st, there were this many DXers reporting. On May 2nd, it was this many reporting. And on May 3rd, it was this many reporting. If I'm one of those people that had ease every one of those 3 days, I'm just counted 3 times now. I'm inflating the number of DXers. We don't want to do that. We want unique DXers. And right now, I don't have a unique DXer count for 2024. But I do for these other seasons. So this is another one. So we talked earlier about how there are more DXers now reporting the FM list than ever. 2023 was our highest number of FM list reporters. It was 109 DXers reporting the FM list in North America in 2023. 104 the year before that, and I think 80-something the year before that. So every year it's gone up. I think the first couple years were like 62, 61 DXers. So we've almost doubled. We're getting close to doubling what was there back in 2017, 2018. So this will help us get an idea of how much of that volume increase that we saw is being driven by more DXers submitting logs. And you can see it's pretty close. It's pretty close to what we saw before. It's not the entire reason, but there is some, because again, this is our volume curve and our bars from the number of DXers reporting, and here is our total logs by season. So it's not an exact match. The trend is the same. The overall trend is the same, but there's not an exact match. Like 2019, we had the number of DXers reporting logs actually went up, but the volume went down. That tells me 2019 was not a good year. And if you talk to DXers who DXed that year, it wasn't. It was terrible. So yeah, I think this, when you look at this metric here, the total logs by season, and compare that to this number of DXers reporting logs, you get a pretty clear idea of how much of that is volume being driven by just a higher reporting percentage. But you can also get a sense of, okay, let me get a context here for just how good a season was. So as an example, I go back to July 2021. There were 72 DXers reporting. That's less than we saw in 22 and in 23. 72 DXers reporting logs in July of 2021, and it had a fewer days reporting ease. But again, going back to our volume, we had significant volume. So what does that tell me? What's the story that this is now telling me? It's telling me that we had a very strong month of really big, long-duration openings. Now, those openings probably were pretty widespread. Maybe not everybody was able to get in on them, but they were widespread enough that a lot of DXers were able to join in, get in there, DX, get those logs, and submit them in the FM list. And the longer those durations go, the longer those openings are, maybe there's multiple paths that we see, right? So now we're seeing, I'm looking up to my northeast into Pennsylvania and New York from here in Louisiana, but now that's starting to drift over into Ohio and Indiana and Illinois, right? It's starting, that cloud drifts and I get a different path that develops. Or maybe I get a second path. I'm seeing New York and Pennsylvania, but now I'm seeing down into Mexico from Louisiana, right? So I'm seeing a different path that's now emerging, a second cloud. So those are the kinds of things that we can kind of start to kind of extrapolate from this data, is that July of 2021, and it was, I remember that, see, I was in Charleston at the time, it was a fantastic season, fantastic month. I can start to look at that and say, okay, these are some bars that we can kind of set of what a good month looks like or a good season looks like. So when we look at our current year, we kind of know how it stacks up. And you can see this is the just the overall growth. These are unique DXers. You can't just total these bars up to get the unique, because some of these 74 that were here in July of 22 were also there in June of 2022, right? We can't just total these up. We have to look at unique DXers, and so that's what this count is here, is unique DXers that we see here. 190 total unique DXers have submitted logs since 2017. Pretty cool, huh? So then, obviously, just like we did with the number of days, now let's take that logs total that we had and the number of DXers reporting. Let's see if we can come up with a number and see if that tells us how good of a season is. And I think, to me, this is the closest thing that I have found to a silver bullet of telling us how good a season is. And again, I'm not going to have this for 2024 yet because we don't have access to that data just yet. But this, looking back at the end of the season, will be very interesting to see how many logs per DXer were there. So this is the efficient way to level set and normalize that volume and say, okay, a typical DXer was able to see how many logs per month, or I guess season, whichever way you're looking at it here. And here we're looking at both. So again, I go back to 139.8 for July of 2021. Was a very, very strong month, logs per DXer. Now, interestingly enough, June of 2018 was our highest performing month that we've had. You go back and you look at all the other data, number of DXers reporting wasn't very strong. Number of logs reported per day was decent at 142, but it definitely wasn't the top. Number of days reported, 26. Okay, it wasn't the best, but it was pretty good. Number of total logs reported, 3,700. So you look at June of 2018, and you think to yourself, there's nothing really significant there, right? But then you get down to this logs per DXer, and you think, okay, well, certain DXers got a lot of DX. There were some people who got a ton of e-skip in 2018, and there were some others that really probably didn't. That's what this tells me. So when you see all those other numbers being kind of low, but then you see this number being really high, that tells me there were some DXers that got a ton of DX in June of 2018 compared to probably everybody else, and they were driving that number up. All right, so let's go ahead and get into, now that we have kind of level set our historical data here, 2017 to 2023, let's go ahead and take a look at our comparisons, and we're going to really kind of focus on those first three metrics you looked at: total number of logs, total number of days, and logs per day, because that's really the three that we have right now. I don't have the DXer count yet, the unique DXer count, obviously, so we can't really dive into that during the midpoint. We'll hopefully have that for our end of the season wrap-up. But those other three can tell us some interesting things. And then we'll take a look and see, okay, now that we've looked at all that, is there an analog to 2024 anywhere in this historical data? So let's start with the comparisons. So we're comparing to the overall average that was set. So when I looked at all those numbers up above of 2017 to 23, we averaged everything up, and we're comparing this to the average. So the average should tell us what a normal mundane season looks like. And then we look at 2024 to see how does it stack up against that. 2024 is in red, averages are in blue. Okay? May of 2024, I remember May was not great. I think we had one decent opening on May 16th this year here in Louisiana, and that was about it. And yet, when I look at the numbers as far as total logs, it's pretty close to average. So it's pretty decent. That tells me, just off of that there should have been something going on there in May of 2024. June, however, woefully underperformed, with only 2,757 logs compared to an average of almost 4,300 logs. We were way under for June. Now, obviously, we're in it right now, so when you see these July numbers as we look over these next couple of graphs here, just remember that's for the first 10 days of the month. So I can't really do anything with this comparison because obviously it's not going to be anywhere near it. But when we get in the next couple, we can see for the first 10 days of the month how is July stacking up, because it can kind of give us like an early, kind of almost near exit poll kind of thing here in this political season that we're in. It can give us kind of an early look at maybe what July might have in store for us. So again, June was the one. Like when you hear people talk about, man, the season just hasn't been good, because June is usually that peak of the season. It's usually the one that's driving everything else. For it to underperform as much as it did, a lot of people have valid reasons to complain about how bad the season has been. But let's look at that from another direction. Let's look at the number of days of E's being reported, and you can see it's actually above average. May, we were 4 days above average in the month of May. We had 19 days with E's being reported somewhere in North America. June, we were at 29. So all but one day, there was only one day in June, I think it was the 5th or somewhere in there. There was one day in June that did not have E's. Every other day, somebody got something. It might have been one DXer up in New England. It might have been one person in Mexico. It might have been a couple guys out west. But, generally speaking, somebody was getting E somewhere in North America all but one day in June. Yet, when we look at the number of logs, we underperform. So what gives? What gives? Oh, and by the way, July, out of the first 10 days, 9 of those had DX. I can actually tell you, because I looked at it last night, 10 of the first 11 had sporadic E reported. So we're about 90%, a little over 90% of July so far has had E's reported during this current month that we're in. Let's hope that trend continues. So obviously the thing that sticks out here is, okay, when we look at the logs per day, this should tell the story, and it does. This tells the story very, very clearly. So yes, we had a large number of days in May and in June that produced E. So we had a lot of events, right? We had an active month in creation of events, but they weren't quality events. They weren't long duration. They weren't huge, widespread events. Our biggest day of the year so far has been June 22nd with 655 logs in one day. That is low for a peak day of the year. Normally, you're looking at 1,000 to 2,000 or more logs in the peak day of the year. 655 is abysmal for your peak day so far. So that tells you the story very, very clearly. There's a lot of short duration events here. There are some hyper-localized or very geographically specific E-openings that are affecting just certain people. And that's exactly what the data is telling me. 53 logs per day in May. So even with more numbers of days, the only reason we had the number of logs that we did was because there were so many events, right? So 19 days, which is above average for May, produced enough logs to keep it competitive. But when we look at the logs per day, they weren't good quality sessions. They were quick in and out. I can't tell you how many times this sporadic E season I'll be in my shack. I'm parked on a frequency. Nothing's going on. Static. I get up. I go into the other room. I talk to my wife. I get something to eat, whatever. I come back in, and there's an RDSD code on the screen from Kansas or wherever, but there's no audio. It's back to static again because we had and I would check the other frequencies on my SDR console, and they would have hits on all of the other frequencies that were open, and my auto logger has a couple of hits. We got this burst of sporadic E that hit, and by the time I came back in a few minutes later, it was already gone, and I couldn't even DX it. All I could really do was just log the RDSD codes that I got. And I would see that other folks had a brief little flare-up, and then it was gone. So we get these little flare-up E openings. They give us a handful of logs. We get to report it on FM lists. It shows up as a day of activity, and then it's gone. And then we don't get anything else the rest of the day. That's the other thing. How many times in the past have we seen that dual opening scenario where you get one in the morning, say 9, 10, 11 o'clock in the morning, and then you get a second peak in the evening, 5, 6, 7, 8 o'clock? Haven't seen that this year. You might get one or the other, but very rarely, I think maybe once or twice have I seen a dual peak scenario this season. And they weren't here. They were other people getting those. So again, geographically specific. Look at June. June was horrible. 95 logs per day. That's 64% of what it should be in a normal average season. Normal average season is 164 logs per day in June, the peak. We were at 64% of that in the month of June this year. So again, lots of little nap bite openings, and then they're gone. And then you don't even have time to hit record probably on your SDR. And even if you did, when I have done that, I'll tell you there was an opening, I think it was June 27th, because I missed the June 22nd opening that everyone else had. June 27th, we had an opening here into like South Dakota, a little bit North Dakota, Minnesota, Iowa, Nebraska, Kansas a little bit. But it wasn't every frequency. It was just some of the open frequencies here in my area. Not even all of the open frequencies produced. Some did. when I would go back, I'd have these big stretches where like nothing. Oh, there's something that popped up for like a minute or two. Nothing. Okay, there's something that popped up for like 5 minutes. This one station was here for like the entire duration, right? So it's to borrow kind of a little pun here, it's very sporadic what we're even seeing in the openings. Where in a traditional sporadic E season, when you get those really big monster openings, they stick around for a while. The MUF goes up, and as you go down, you can guarantee if that MUF is at 107.9, anything open below that's got something on it. Not this season. Not this season. There's a lot of empty, static-filled frequencies with no E's, while there are other frequencies that have E's during an opening. It's mind-boggling and maddening at the same time. A little bit of hope. July is at 70.4 logs per day so far. And I can't believe I'm saying that because that's not even half of what it should be for the month. But I'm saying in the first 10 days, there's hope in here that maybe we can start seeing some stuff happening here in July. So let's take a look at that. Let's look and see what do we have from an analog perspective that might be able to help us see what we're seeing this year compared to other years and maybe how that season performed. And the year is 2020. When you look at these numbers, it's almost scary how closely they line up, actually. So let's look at some numbers and compare this year so far to 2020. Starting with total logs, there were 1,022 in 2020. We were at 1,008 in May. So that's pretty close. Both were right below the average of 1,031. So they're pretty close to each other. June had 2,954 logs. We were at 2,757. So we were a little under that. But both June 2020 and 2024 were well under the average. I'm not going to do the comparison on July because there's no point on that particular metric. But I mean, that's pretty close. Let's look at the number of days where E's were reported. 13 in 2020. We had 19 this year. So it was below average that year as far as amount of activity in May. We were above average. So there's one kind of, I guess, little glimmer of hope, I guess. 27 days in June. We had 29. Both were above average. So that's pretty much a wash, right? That's pretty close. Now let's look at the logs per day. I'm gonna come back to July and August here in a little bit. Logs per day. This is the big one, right? May, 2020 had 79 logs per day, which was above average. We were 53, which is below average. So even with they had 2020 had more logs with fewer days. That's why that number is higher than what we have. I remember 2020. That was a terrible season for me. I didn't get anything when I was in Charleston. We had nothing that year. Kind of like how the East Coast is getting skunked this season. It was that way for me in Charleston in 2020. It was a terrible season. Then you look at June. 2020 sat at 109.4, which is below average. We're at 95, which is obviously below average. So, not great. Not great. We're looking unfavorable compared to what 2020 was. Like, we're better than 2019 for sure, but we're not even quite to 2020 standards. So, again, there's no crystal ball here. I can't give you a forecast. I can't look at this and say, well, because this is so closely aligned with 2020, and it is very, very closely, especially the total number of logs. That's very close. There's nothing I can look at that says, okay, this is what we can expect in July and August, because that just doesn't exist. We don't have any modeling that gives us that kind of certainty. But maybe we can look at the numbers and see if there's anything we can glean. Okay. There were 24 days with E's in July, okay, and the average is 25. We're already at 9, actually 10. Now, August had 11. The average is 11. We'll see. The number of logs in July of 2020 was 1,380. We're already at 634. Actually, we're at 800 and something now because there were some more that came in on the 11th after I'd already completed this analysis. So we're almost there to that number. We're averaging 70.4 logs per day, and probably a little bit more than that now, for July of 2024. The 2020 season averaged 57.5. Now, both of those numbers are terrible. They're, 57.5 is awful. 70.4 is a little better, but it's still not even half of what it should be for an average season. So, regardless, I think we're going to end up below average for this year, no matter what July does. With a caveat to that. I'll come back to that in a second. August, we'll see, obviously, what could happen. But, there was a handful of openings that happened there. There were 11 days, and it led to about 42.8 logs per day that season. So maybe August might help us out a little bit. So if you're looking for... Let me do this, since I can't really do a crystal ball here. If you're looking for reasons to be hopeful, let me give you that. July is on the upswing at 70.4 logs per day so far. It's actually a little bit higher now, but we're up above 2020 as far as July logs per day so far. That's reason to be hopeful. And if we continued at that rate, 70.4, okay, and if we kept our 90% production rate as far as number of days producing, right? Do the math here. So 90% would be 28 days. So if we had 28 days and we had 70.4 logs per day, we would end up with 1,971 logs in the month of July. Well above what 2020 had, right? Still below average, but decent. Not as good as June, but decent. Could we keep that 70.4 average? Yeah, we could. It's nothing to write home about. It's nothing to be like, oh, hey, that's a good number. No, it's not. It's terrible. But it could at least give us another 12, 13, 1,400 logs to play with here in July. So that would be if we just kind of kept an average of the average below average. Okay? If we just kept going on this kind of below average track that we have, we could have that. Okay? If we want to be super optimistic, July can be a barn burner of a year. Look back to July of 2021. Okay? Let me scroll back up here. July of 2021. We know it had 28 days, just like we have on track for. We're trending towards 28 days for this year. They were at 93 or 90.3% in 2021 as well. And they ended up with 10,000 logs that month. Now, I don't think we're going to hit that number, but it would only take a couple of openings, say 2, maybe 3 openings of 2,000 to 3,000 logs per day to get us close, right? If we had a 2,000 log day 3 times this month, right? That's a little over 6, so we'd be somewhere around 7,000. I think all of us would agree a 7,000 log July would mean, hey, we're doing pretty good, right? So it just takes I look back to, and if you want a good example of a season or a month where that actually occurred, take a look no further than May of 2023. You see how much higher May is than all these other years of May, all right? That 2445, there was a big opening on May 31st last year that did that, 2445. Every other year it was like under 2,000. This went over 2,000 for the month, and it was that one day that did it. And it was the last day of the month, right? So, and there were 21 days that year that produced E's in May, but one of them just rocked it. So, that's not an unprecedented thing that can happen. June 11th last year was like an 8-hour opening, and it really pushed it, right? And we see June, let me go back up here again. Logs reported per day, June of last year was 253.7. If we had a 253.7 month for logs per day in July of this year, forget it. We're going to have a very fun month ahead of us. So that's if you want to be optimistic and super optimistic. Those are some paths that I can give to you that might help us out. If we want to look the pessimistic route, it could get worse. We could end up at that 57.5 logs per day that we had in 2020 and actually see this production go down. We go from like 28, 29 days of activity in July down to like 23, 24. Now we're really bottoming out, right? So if you want to go the pessimistic route, you could see it actually get worse. You could see that there might be a handful of openings, but they're not really going to produce much. It's just enough to kind of abate your quench your thirst, I guess, and that's about it. So there you go. Those are some options if you want to go optimistic or pessimistic. All this information, all this data, and my analysis and talking points, as you can kind of see, are going to be available on our State of the Sporadic Es season website, which I'll have linked in the video description here. But really quick before we exit out our conclusion. So 2024, by almost every metric we look at, is a below average season so far. The one metric that we're actually doing pretty good is the number of days, so the activity itself. The number of days of active sporadic E openings is above average, but everything else is below, right? May and June were above average in number of E producing days. When we look at the number of logs per day, though, we're very way short on the averages and even our analog season of 2020. The most logical conclusion from this is that while there have been an above average number of openings, they've been short-lived and limited in their reach and duration, i.e. not every DXer is able to participate in the opening. When they do, they're short-lived. Our peak day of the year is 655 logs on June 22nd is even below average for peak day of the season, so even the event that should have been most inclusive in log producing came up short. There is reason for both hope and pessimism in the data for the rest of the year. The closest analog season, 2024, has so far lined up pretty closely to the performance of 2024. While that's no guarantee the second half will follow suit, it may help us set the context for what we've seen thus far. If the second half of this season aligns with 2020 performance, we'll actually see a reduction in E-production log-wise in the second half of the season. However, the first 10 days of July actually gives us a glimmer of hope that maybe we might be a little bit more productive than that 2020 second half of the season with a higher log per day average than that of July of 2020. If we can keep that number up, that 70.4, or increase it, we might have ourselves a decent month yet here in July. So that's a look at the 2024 season thus far. Again, I'll have the link for this page with all the analysis and all the data charts on our video description down below. If you have any questions, feel free to drop us a line, and that's just info@dxcentralonline.com. Any questions or concerns you want to bring to our attention. Hopefully this has been a at least interesting look into the numbers behind the Sporadic E season. And if you need something to tell somebody, hey, this season's been awful, and they say, no, it hadn't been that bad, I have a nice little case study here for you of why it's been not a great season. So there you go. 73, my friends, best of DX. Let's hope this season does turn it around and we get some big monster openings here in July. It can happen. Hold out the hope, and hope to see you here in a few months after the season is over, and maybe we have had a chance to look back on it with favorable eyes. Take care, my friends. Best of DX and 73.